April 1st, 1933. A Saturday morning in Berlin. A Jewish-owned tailor's shop on the Kurfürstendamm has its windows freshly painted with the word Jude, Jew, in crude yellow letters. Two SA men in brown uniforms stand at the entrance, arms folded, eyes fixed on anyone who approaches. A woman stops, hesitates, turns away. Then another. Then another. Inside, the shopkeeper, a man who had fought for Germany in the trenches of the First World War, who had two sons, who had pinned an iron cross on his chest and wept with relief when the war ended, stands behind his counter. He is waiting. He does not yet know that he will wait for years before understanding there is no waiting this out. That boycott lasted only one day. The Nazi leadership called it off after 24 hours, nervous about international economic pressure. And so most Germans went back to their Saturday routines. Markets opened, children played, coffee was poured, and in Jewish households across Germany. In apartments in Frankfurt, in townhouses in Munich, in modest flats in Hamburg. Fathers and mothers told each other the same thing. It will pass. It always passes. We have been here before. They had been here before. German Jews were among the most integrated Jewish communities in the world. They had fought in Germany's wars, won its prizes, written its literature, composed its music, practiced its medicine, and taught in its universities. They spoke German as their mother tongue. They considered themselves Germans first. Their synagogues were built in the style of German civic architecture. Their children went to German schools. Their grandparents were buried in German soil. And yet, what follows is not a story of a sudden catastrophe. There was no single morning when everything changed, no single law, no single speech, no single event that transformed ordinary life into persecution overnight. What happened to Jewish life in Germany between 1933 and 1939 was something far more insidious than a sudden explosion. It was a slow erosion, a tightening, a bureaucratic suffocation carried out one form, one decree, one dismissed employee, one cancelled license, one painted window at a time. This is the story of what that actually felt like. Not from the perspective of generals or politicians, not from conference rooms where decisions were made with cold efficiency, but from kitchens, classrooms, school corridors, park benches, family dinner tables where people tried, desperately, stubbornly, humanly, to believe that normal life was still possible. It was not. But the journey from that April Saturday in 1933 to the darkness that followed is a journey worth understanding fully. Because understanding how ordinary life becomes impossible is the only way to understand how ordinary people let it happen. This is what life was really like for Jews in the early years of the Nazi regime. To understand what was taken, you must first understand what existed. By 1933, Germany's Jewish community numbered roughly 525,000 people, less than 1% of the total German population. It was a community remarkable not for its size, but for its depth of integration. Over the preceding century, following Napoleon's reorganization of European society and the slow liberalization of German political life, Jews in Germany had moved, generation by generation, from the margins of society toward its center, legally emancipated, professionally mobile, culturally ambitious. In Berlin's western districts, Charlottenburg, Wilmersdorf, Schöneberg, Jewish families had built lives indistinguishable in their outward texture from those of their Christian neighbors. They shopped at the same markets, rode the same trams, attended the same concerts. They sent their children to the same schools. Their apartments were furnished with the same bourgeois care. Heavy oak sideboards, framed photographs, carefully pressed linens, books arranged on shelves with the pride of people who believe deeply in education's the passport to belonging. Those books mattered. German Jews read voraciously. They produced a disproportionate share of Germany's intellectuals, journalists, and artists. Sigmund Freud had transformed how the Western world understood the human mind. Albert Einstein had rewritten the laws of physics. Heinrich Heine, a convert, complicated, unclassifiable, had written some of the most beautiful German poetry ever composed. These were not peripheral figures. They were central to what Germany understood itself to be. In the professions, Jewish participation was high and visible. Jewish doctors practiced across Germany's cities. Jewish lawyers filled the courtrooms. Jewish professors lectured in universities in Berlin, Frankfurt, Heidelberg. In medicine, in law, in academia, the numbers exceeded what simple demographics would predict. The product of generations of emphasis on learning as survival, and of a community that had found, in professional achievement, the surest path to social acceptance. Not every Jewish German was prosperous. The Jewish community was not monolithic. There were wealthy merchants and struggling peddlers. There were fully secular Jews who had not set foot in a synagogue in decades, and deeply observant Jews for whom the rhythms of the Sabbath and the Jewish holidays structured every week. There were Zionists who believed the only future lay in a Jewish homeland, and German nationalists who believed with equal fervor that Germany was their homeland and that nothing, not even rising antisemitism, would change that. There were recent immigrants from Eastern Europe, more visibly different in dress and custom, and families who had been in Germany for centuries and could trace their roots to the medieval period. This diversity mattered, because it meant that when the Nazi regime began to define who was a Jew, it was not defining a coherent community with shared politics or shared beliefs. It was constructing a category, imposing a single identity on people whose only true commonality was ancestry. The diversity that characterized Jewish life in Germany became, under Nazi racial law, irrelevant. You were what the state said you were. But in 1932, in the last months before Hitler's appointment as Chancellor on January 30th, 1933, most German Jews looked at the Nazi movement with serious concern, not existential terror. Yes, the rhetoric was virulent. Yes, the SA brown shirts were violent. Yes, the speeches were full of conspiratorial hatred. But political movements in the Weimar Republic had always been extreme. The communists were extreme. The nationalists were extreme. Germany had survived political extremism before. The Republic's institutions, its courts, its civil service, its constitution would hold. Reasonable people said so. Intelligent people said so. Experienced people who had watched European politics for decades said so. They were wrong. And the first proof of how wrong they were came not with a pogrom or a massacre, but with something far quieter and far more lasting. It came with paperwork. The process began with a law that most people outside Germany have never read. On April 7th, 1933, 6 days after that one-day boycott, the Nazi government passed the law for the restoration of the professional civil service. The title was deliberately bland, but its contents were precise and surgical. Any civil servant of non-Aryan descent, meaning in practice, any civil servant with at least one Jewish grandparent, was to be dismissed from their position. At a stroke, Jewish judges were removed from courtrooms. Jewish professors were cleared from university lecture halls. Jewish teachers were expelled from state schools. Jewish officials vanished from municipal governments. The bureaucracy, the spine of German institutional life, was purged of Jewish presence with the efficiency that only bureaucracy can achieve. The dismissals were not announced with fanfare. They came in letters, in memos, in quiet meetings where a department head informed an employee of 30 years that his services were no longer required. The law provided for notification periods, for pension considerations. for all the administrative courtesy that makes organized injustice feel almost reasonable in the moment of its delivery. Think about what this meant in daily life. A judge who had presided over cases for 20 years received a letter, cleared his desk, and walked out of a building he had entered every morning for 2 decades. A professor who had taught chemistry or philosophy or history, who had shaped the minds of hundreds of German students, was informed that his lectures were cancelled, that his office was needed, that the university thanked him for his service. A school teacher who had taught German children to read stood at the front of a classroom for the last time without warning. The professional world contracted almost immediately. The German Medical Association moved to exclude Jewish doctors from participation in the state health insurance system, effectively making it economically difficult for Jewish doctors to maintain a general practice. The German Bar Association began pressuring Jewish lawyers. Jewish journalists found their press credentials revoked. Jewish actors were removed from the Reich Chamber of Culture, without membership in which no one could legally work in the arts. In households across Germany, dinner table conversations changed their texture. What had been discussions of work, of cases, students, patients, articles, performances, became discussions of what to do next. Fathers who had defined themselves by their professions for their entire adult lives sat in their kitchens and tried to explain to their children why they were no longer going to the office. Mothers calculated, quietly, how long savings would last. The emigration question arose for the first time in many families, and it was not a simple question. For younger people, especially those without deep roots, those who had skills that were internationally transferable, the logic of leaving was becoming harder to ignore. Thousands left Germany in 1933. Intellectuals, artists, scientists, doctors who could find positions abroad. Einstein was already in the United States when Hitler was appointed chancellor and chose not to return. Others followed to Paris, to London, to Palestine, to New York. But the majority stayed. And their reasons for staying are essential to understand, because in retrospect those reasons are easily dismissed as naive. They were not naive. They were human. Germany was home. The language was home. The streets were home. The graves where parents and grandparents were buried were home. Many Jews had non-Jewish spouses, non-Jewish neighbors of 30 years, colleagues and friends who privately expressed their embarrassment at what was happening. The idea that one might be forced, permanently, to abandon everything that constituted a life was not easy to accept as reality. The mind resists it, the heart resists it, and practically, where would one go? Emigration required money, connections, an accepting country. Many nations were not welcoming. Immigration quotas were strict. The United States, Britain, France, all had limits. Palestine, under British mandate, had restrictions. The world beyond Germany was not standing with arms open, so most stayed and adjusted. New professional organizations formed, Jewish cultural associations, Jewish schools, a Jewish press. If the German mainstream was closing its doors, Jews would create their own institutions within those closing walls. It was a dignified and pragmatic response. It was also, though no one yet fully understood this, the beginning of an enforced separation that the Nazi regime would continue to deepen year by year. The forms kept multiplying. New ones appeared monthly. Forms to register, to certify, to prove, to declare. Germans filled out forms to demonstrate what their grandparents had been. Offices were established specifically to process these forms. Bureaucrats were hired specifically to evaluate them. In a country famous for its administrative orderliness, the machinery of exclusion had found its natural medium, and 1933 was only the beginning. In 1934, Germany appeared, to the casual outside observer, to be stabilizing. The violence of the early months had receded. The SA brown shirts were less visible on the streets. International journalists wrote cautiously that perhaps the worst of the Nazi revolution had passed. Foreign governments, calculating trade interests against moral concerns, chose engagement over condemnation. The Olympic Games were coming to Berlin in 1936. Germany was still a country the world did business with. For Jewish Germans, the experience of 1934 was something different. The violence was indeed less visible, but the bureaucratic walls were not receding. They were multiplying. They were being codified. They were becoming, one decree at a time, the structure of daily life itself. Jewish children were still attending German schools in 1934, but the texture of those days had changed irreparably. Teachers who had once ignored the question of who in the classroom was Jewish now found the question was everywhere. The curriculum had shifted. Racial biology became a subject, a pseudo-science given the weight of official truth, presented to children in classrooms with charts and measurements and language borrowed from legitimate science to dress up what was essentially a taxonomy of hatred. Children were taught to identify facial features, skull shapes, bloodlines. They were taught that these characteristics determined value. They were taught this the same way they were taught arithmetic and grammar, as established fact. What did it mean to sit in that classroom as a Jewish child? To listen while the teacher explained calmly, using the language of science, that you were of lesser value? That your blood was a contamination? Some Jewish children describe a strange dissociation. The sense that the lesson could not possibly be about them because nothing in the lesson matched what they knew of themselves, their families, their lives. Others describe a slow, corrosive shame, the internalization of contempt that they would spend decades afterward trying to excavate and discard. And then came September 15th, 1935, the Nuremberg Party rally. Beneath enormous swastika banners, before a vast choreographed crowd, Adolf Hitler announced what became known as the Nuremberg Laws. 2 laws. Quiet in their language, absolute in their consequences. The law for the protection of German blood and German honor prohibited marriage and sexual relations between Jews and non-Jews. The Reich citizenship law stripped Jews of German citizenship. They were no longer citizens. They were subjects, Staatsangehörige, a word that translated their status into something sub-civic, something legally diminished. The rights that citizenship had provided, to vote, to hold public office, to be protected by the full apparatus of the state, were removed by the stroke of a pen. The implementation decrees that followed over the next months attempted to define precisely who was a Jew. This turned out to be genuinely complicated in ways the ideologues had not anticipated. Germany had centuries of intermarriage, conversion, and mixed heritage. How many Jewish grandparents made one a Jew? The answer, 2 or more in most circumstances, was a bureaucratic judgment, not a racial fact, dressed in the clothing of racial science. What the Nuremberg Laws accomplished, however, was not primarily scientific. It was psychological and social. They told every German, Jewish and non-Jewish alike, exactly where the line was. They formalized what had been informal. They made the exclusion of Jews not a matter of party enthusiasm, but of state law. A German non-Jew who maintained a Jewish friendship was not merely making an unfashionable choice. They were potentially in legal jeopardy. The law now policed intimacy itself. In Jewish homes, the laws landed with the force of something that could no longer be minimized. Letters were written to relatives abroad. The emigration discussions intensified, but the trap was also tightening. As Jewish professionals were displaced, as businesses struggled under boycott and legal restriction, the financial resources to emigrate were diminishing. Getting out required money. Money was becoming harder to hold on to. The Jewish community continued to function, continued to organize, continued, with remarkable tenacity, to maintain cultural and educational life. The Reich representation of Jews in Germany, established in 1933, tried to coordinate social welfare for those who had lost their livelihoods. New schools were opened as Jewish children were increasingly pushed out of German ones. A Jewish press continued to publish. Theaters and cultural clubs offered a fragile sense of normalcy. But normalcy required a kind of willful labor now. You had to work to feel normal. You had to deliberately not think about certain things. You had to choose each morning to put one foot in front of the other and attend to the day's tasks rather than sit with what was happening around you. That labor, the cognitive and emotional work of maintaining dignity under sustained assault, is almost impossible to quantify. But it was the central experience of Jewish life in Germany by 1935. The circle was tightening. Those inside it could feel the pressure. They could not yet see the walls. In the summer of 1936, Berlin became the center of the world's attention. The Olympic Games arrived, and with them something the Nazi regime needed: the appearance of normality, of civility, of a modern, confident, tolerant nation hosting the global community. The regime understood the optics. For the duration of the Games, the most aggressively anti-Semitic signage was quietly removed from some public spaces. The Der Stürmer display cases, those grotesque anti-Semitic newspaper boards that dotted German streets, were taken down in central Berlin. Foreign visitors walked through a city that presented a curated version of itself. Organized, beautiful, architecturally grand, full of smiling officials and efficient service and the spectacle of athletic excellence. Jesse Owens won 4 gold medals. The world watched. It seemed briefly as though the Nazi regime might be containable. A theatrical nationalism, unpleasant but not catastrophic, capable of presenting a reasonable face to the international community. Behind the facade, nothing had changed. The moment the Olympic flame was extinguished, the signs went back up. The decrees continued, the informal exclusions, the 1,000 small negotiations of daily life in which Jewish Germans had to navigate an increasingly hostile landscape, resumed without interruption. By 1936 and 1937, the economic assault on Jewish life had become systematic and relentless. The process of Aryanization, was accelerating. Jewish-owned businesses were being transferred, under heavy legal and social pressure, to non-Jewish German owners, typically at prices far below market value. A business that a family had built over decades, a shop, a factory, a legal practice, a medical clinic, could be taken for a fraction of its worth. The state provided legal mechanisms. Local officials participated, and many ordinary Germans, neighbors, business rivals, opportunists, took advantage. The process was not always violent. It was often administrative. A Jewish business owner might receive notices from authorities raising questions about tax compliance. A license might be threatened. A lease might suddenly not be renewed by a landlord who had received quiet guidance about the undesirability of Jewish tenants. The language of bureaucracy masked what was, in effect, organized theft. In kitchens, the conversations had turned sharper. Savings were shrinking. The professions that had supported families were now closed or closing. Adults who had spent their working lives building something, a career, a practice, a business, were now watching it be dismantled. Not by mob violence primarily, but by paperwork, by officials with briefcases and forms and rubber stamps. Children were navigating a different kind of daily complexity. By 1936, Jewish children in German schools faced steadily increasing hostility. Teachers sometimes humiliated Jewish students openly, using them as examples in racial biology lessons, asking them to stand while the class examined their features. Classmates, absorbing what the culture was telling them about Jewish inferiority, translated ideology into the language of childhood. Taunts, exclusions, physical intimidation in schoolyards. Not all non-Jewish children participated. Some maintained friendships with Jewish classmates at personal cost. But the social pressure was immense, and children are exquisitely sensitive to social pressure. Many Jewish families made the wrenching decision to remove their children from German schools entirely. Jewish schools expanded to absorb them. These schools, organized, determined, often excellent, tried to provide not just education, but a protected space. A place where a child could sit at a desk without waiting to be humiliated. A place where Jewish identity was not a mark of shame, but of belonging. But even within that protection, the world outside was impossible to entirely shut out. Children saw the signs on park benches that read, "Jews not welcome." They saw which shops displayed cards in their windows announcing they did not serve Jews. They heard the radio, unavoidable in a Germany where the regime had made the Volksempfänger, the people's receiver, a centerpiece of its propaganda effort. They absorbed, through every channel of daily life, the message that they were unwanted. And they watched their parents. They watched fathers who had been doctors or lawyers or shopkeepers navigate the daily indignities of a society that was systematically expelling them. They watched mothers calculate, plan, worry. They watched adults make decisions about whether to stay or go and struggle, visibly, with choices that had no good answers. The emigration numbers were rising. By 1937, roughly 130,000 Jews had left Germany, about a quarter of the pre-1933 community, but roughly 375,000 remained, some because they could not afford to leave, some because they still believed, against mounting evidence, that the regime would moderate, some because the places they might have gone were increasingly unwilling to receive them. The world was watching, and the world, with a few exceptions, was not opening its doors. What was coming was still ahead. But the architecture of what was coming was already in place. By the beginning of 1938, anyone paying careful attention could see that the legal and social exclusion of German Jews was accelerating towards something, though almost no one could have named precisely what. The pace of Aryanization increased dramatically. A decree in April 1938 required all Jews to register their assets if valued above 5,000 Reichsmarks, a direct prerequisite for their seizure. Jewish business owners faced intensified pressure to sell. In some cities, local Nazi officials were conducting what amounted to organized campaigns of economic extortion, threatening violence or legal action unless owners signed over their enterprises at whatever price the buyer chose to name. And then, in March, Germany absorbed Austria. The Anschluss brought approximately 200,000 Austrian Jews into the Reich overnight. What had taken 5 years to construct in Germany was imposed on Austrian Jews in a matter of weeks, with a violence and speed that shocked even some observers who had become accustomed to the German pace of persecution. In Vienna, Jews were forced to scrub the pavements with toothbrushes, while crowds watched and jeered. Businesses were seized without even the pretense of administrative process. The ugliness that had been partially managed in Germany erupted in Austria with a rawness that revealed what the bureaucratic language had always been concealing. It was a preview. On the night of November 9th and into the early hours of November 10th, 1938, the mask came off entirely. What became known as Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, was triggered by the assassination in Paris of a German diplomat by a young Jewish man, Herschel Grinspan, who had been pushed to desperation by the treatment of his family. The Nazi regime used the assassination as the pretext for what it had likely been planning to do regardless. Across Germany and Austria, SA men and ordinary citizens, mobilized, directed, and in many cases simply unleashed, attacked Jewish synagogues, businesses, and homes. More than 7,500 Jewish businesses had their windows smashed. Approximately 1,400 synagogues were attacked. Many were burned. The streets were covered with broken glass, the image so vivid and total that it gave the night its name. Jewish men were attacked in their homes and on the streets. Women were assaulted. Children watched. Nearly 100 Jews were killed directly during the pogrom. But the number most significant for what came next was this. Approximately 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps, Dachau, Sachsenhausen, Buchenwald, in the days that followed. These were not criminals. They were fathers, sons, shopkeepers, doctors, retired veterans. They were arrested not for what they had done, but for what they were. Many were released after weeks or months, but only on condition that they could demonstrate imminent immigration. The message was unmistakable. Leave, or what happened in the camp will happen again and will not be temporary. The regime's response to the pogrom was, characteristically, bureaucratic. The Jewish community was fined 1 billion Reichsmarks for the destruction, punished, that is, for having been attacked. Jewish business owners were required to repair their own damaged storefronts at their own expense. The insurance payouts that should have compensated them were confiscated by the state. Jews were excluded from German economic life by decree, no longer permitted to own retail businesses, employ non-Jewish workers, or operate independently in virtually any commercial capacity. In the weeks after Kristallnacht, the emigration offices in German cities were overwhelmed. The lines stretched around blocks. People who had hesitated for years, who had found reasons to stay, who had told themselves it could not get worse, were now desperate to leave. But the administrative machinery of emigration was slow, and the receiving countries were still reluctant. The United States, Britain, and France maintained their immigration restrictions. The St. Louis, a ship carrying over 900 Jewish refugees that sailed in May 1939, would be turned away from Cuba and the United States and forced to return to Europe, where many of its passengers would perish in the Holocaust. In Jewish households in the weeks and months after Kristallnacht, the domestic world had been hollowed out. Objects that had represented the stability of a life, china, silverware, furniture, photographs, books, were being packed into crates or sold for what they could bring. Apartments were being given up. Goodbyes were being said, many of them final, though those saying them could not yet know that. Children who had grown up in the confident assumption that they were Germans, that Germany was their country, that its culture was their culture, that its future was their future, were being told, with finality, that they had been wrong. Not because they had done anything, not because of any quality they possessed as individuals, but because of what their grandparents had been, because of what the state had decided they were. The careful, methodical, administrative construction of the previous 5 years had done its work. The isolation was complete. The economic destruction was largely accomplished. The violence had been tested openly on a national scale and had met with no serious internal resistance. And the world beyond Germany had watched and had not intervened. What was left was a community of approximately 350,000 people, diminished, impoverished, terrorized, increasingly desperate, enclosed within walls that had no doors. The night was getting very dark, and the worst had not yet arrived. January 1939. In a speech before the Reichstag, Adolf Hitler offered what he called a prophecy. If the world's financiers, by which he meant the Jews, succeeded in plunging nations into another world war, the result would be the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. The word he used was Vernichtung, annihilation. The speech was broadcast on German radio. It was reported in German newspapers. It was heard by people eating breakfast, by shopkeepers opening their shutters, by children being helped into their coats before school. It was part of the texture of January in Germany in 1939, a threat spoken aloud in official language at the highest level of state authority. Most people who heard it did not believe it literally. That was perhaps the most important thing about it. Even the people most targeted by it, German Jews who heard it or read it, tended to interpret it as rhetoric. as the extreme language that fascist politics had always trafficked in, as something beyond the boundary of what a modern European state could actually do. This failure of imagination was not stupidity. It was the product of all the centuries of experience that told human beings that the civilized world had its limits, that there were things governments could not do, that the international community, the churches, the legal traditions of Western civilization, something would prevent the literal destruction of an entire people. They were wrong, but they could not yet know how wrong. For the Jews still in Germany in 1939, the daily texture of life had become almost unrecognizable compared to 1933. The legal framework was total. Jewish children could no longer attend German schools. By 1939, even the Jewish schools established in previous years were struggling. Their teachers were being arrested or had emigrated, their resources were exhausted, their student populations were shrinking as families left. Jewish professional life had been essentially eliminated. The businesses were gone or in the process of being transferred. The apartments in desirable neighborhoods were being vacated under pressure, and the Jews concentrated in particular buildings, particular streets. A preliminary segregation whose full implications were not yet visible. The remaining Jewish community in Germany was aging and impoverished. The young and mobile had largely gone. What remained was people who could not afford to leave, people who were too old or too ill to undertake emigration, people who were caring for elderly parents and could not abandon them, people who had tried and failed to secure the papers that leaving required. And then, September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. The war that Hitler had spoken of began, and with it, the situation of Jews in Germany, already catastrophic, underwent another transformation. The wartime regulations that descended on the Jewish community in the month that followed were relentless. Curfews, ration restrictions. Jews received smaller food rations than German non-Jews by official decree. Jews were forbidden to own radios, forbidden to use public telephones, forbidden to enter certain public spaces, required to wear the yellow star. Not yet in Germany in 1939, that would come in September 1941. But the preparation for that moment was already underway. The world beyond Germany was now at war. The emigration routes that had existed were closing one by one. The European countries that had offered potential refuge were being occupied. The United States was not yet in the war and maintained its restrictions. Palestine was under British restrictions that were tightening. The world in which a Jewish family could pack its bags and find a new home was shrinking catastrophically. In the autumn of 1939, a new set of administrative preparations was being made in offices the Jewish community of Germany knew nothing about. Plans for what to do with the Jews of Poland, over 3 million of them, a number that dwarfed Germany's entire Jewish population, were being drawn up in the cold, efficient language of German bureaucracy. Ghettos, concentration points, population management. The language was not yet the language of extermination, but the infrastructure of mass control was being constructed. In German Jewish households, the winter of 1939 was a season of profound fear and profound uncertainty. People listened, where they could still listen before the radios were taken, to whatever information reached them. They wrote letters to relatives abroad, letters that were increasingly censored, increasingly desperate in their subtext, even when carefully neutral on their surface. They sat at tables and calculated again and again the diminishing options. The orderly, integrated, culturally rich world that had existed in 1932 was gone. What replaced it was a life conducted in the narrow margins that the state permitted. And those margins were getting narrower with every passing month. The forms had become walls. The walls had become a cage. And outside the cage, the war was remaking the world in ways that would soon make Germany's treatment of its Jews look like only the beginning of something vastly larger and vastly darker. The door to the world they had known had been closing for 6 years. Now it closed completely. We began with a tailor's shop on a Berlin street, a man behind a counter, a day's worth of customers who turned away. The scale of what followed, the ghettos, the transports, the camps, the 6 million, can feel too large for the human mind to hold. And perhaps that is why the early years matter so much to understand. Because the early years are scaled to human experience. They are the years of forms and classrooms and park benches and dinner table conversations. The years of ordinary life being dismantled one small piece at a time. Between 1933 and 1939, the German state did not murder its Jewish citizens. It did something different first. It unmade them. It removed their professions, their citizenship, their businesses, their children's futures, their neighbors' willingness to look them in the eye. It removed their belonging. It told them, through every instrument of modern state power, law, education, media, bureaucracy, violence, that they were not German, had never been German, would never be German. And then it watched to see whether anyone would stop it. The international community did not stop it. Neighboring countries did not stop it. The German non-Jewish majority did not stop it. Though within that majority, there was a spectrum of response. From enthusiastic participation to quiet complicity to private shame to a handful of acts of courage that history has preserved precisely because they were so rare. The Jews of Germany responded with remarkable dignity and organization, with schools, welfare networks, cultural institutions, and a refusal to be psychologically destroyed by what was happening. But dignity is not a protection against state power, and courage is not a shield against a legal system designed to eliminate you. What the years 1933 to 1939 teach us, if we are willing to sit with their full weight, is that catastrophe does not announce itself. It arrives through the accumulation of small surrenders. A form signed, a law accepted, a neighbor no longer greeted, a bench no longer sat upon, a child no longer included in the schoolyard game. It builds in the space between what people say publicly and what they know privately. It flourishes in the willingness of ordinary people to look away from what is happening to other ordinary people. It is built, in other words, from the same materials as civilization itself, from institutions, from paperwork, from the routine, from the ordinary. The tailor with the Iron Cross on his chest had given Germany everything he had. Germany had taken it back, piece by piece, with the calm efficiency of a well-run administrative office. His story, and the stories of the hundreds of thousands like him, is not a story only about the past. It is a story about what human societies are capable of when the machinery of the state is turned against the people within it. And when enough people decide that this is someone else's problem to solve. The glass was broken. The silence that followed was everyone's. And the worst was still to come. If this story moved you, challenged you, or helped you see the Second World War differently, it would be an honor to have you join our growing community. Subscribing isn't just a click. It's a way to support more powerful stories, more forgotten voices, and more truth from the past. So if you believe these stories matter, hit that subscribe button, and let's keep building this journey together. And don't forget to leave a comment. We read everyone and love hearing your thoughts. Until next time, keep exploring history with Epic War. Keep asking questions, keep seeking the truth,